Howdy, y'all. I thought it would be a good idea as we prepare for the July 4th weekend, Independence Day and all that, to do a brief video talking about some of the quotes and some of the statements that the Founding Fathers had about Independence Day, about independence in general. The first quote that I want to give you is one from John Adams, a great founding father, and it was an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to his wife Abigail on July 3rd, the day after the Declaration of Independence was signed. But this was the quote from John Adams. "I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, which is shows, an archaic spelling of shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore." Very interesting. Of course, he places great emphasis on actually celebrating Independence Day, but also, as we'll see, is very common, made a clear connection with God and righteousness and Christianity in the formation of the country. Here's another quote from John Adams. "The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity." That's a quote that would not be popular today, and I'm guessing there's several reasons why it is not very much in the pop culture or the mainstream narrative. There is a clear and inextricable connection between Christianity in general and freedom, and particularly America, and we have to come to terms with that. That is not common or popular today, but it is true. Here's another quote from John Adams. "The Declaration of Independence laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity." Very interesting. This is a quote from Sam Adams. "If ever time should come when vain and aspiring men shall possess the highest seats in government, our country will stand in need of its experienced patriots to prevent its ruin." Boy, this is one that sure rings true today, doesn't it? There's an important emphasis on individual responsibility and action to maintain our freedom and to maintain things as the way they were meant to be. And Sam Adams' quote here rings especially true in today's current political environment. Here's a quote from Benjamin Franklin, and it was a sentiment that was echoed by more than one founding father. "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." Very apt as we think about Independence Day. Here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. "The practice of morality being necessary for the well-being of society," and that's something we've talked about a lot, and again, a very common belief, or one of the foundational beliefs of our founding, the practice of morality being necessary for the well-being of society, he, that being God, has taken care to impress its precepts so indelibly on our hearts that they shall not be effaced by the subtleties of our brain. We all agree in the obligation of the moral principles of Jesus, and nowhere will they be found delivered in greater purity than in his discourses." Something that is not as common as it should be, but as we think about this quote, perhaps Bible reading should be an important part of our July 4th celebrations. It certainly is a key to us being able to remain free. We cannot have freedom without morality. Here's a quote from Benjamin Rush. "The only foundation for a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this there can be no virtue. And without virtue, there can be no liberty. And liberty is the object and life of all republican governments." Another quote from John Adams. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And why would this be true? Why would they emphasize that freedom is not available without morality? Well, there's a quote from James Madison that helps illustrate this, something we've talked about a lot. "Sufficient virtue among men for self-government. Otherwise," and this isn't part of the quote, but the alternative, going to the next part of the quote, "nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another." One important, vital thing to understand about freedom, something that our founding fathers understood very well and took great pains to try and account for, was that if men are not morally disciplined, if men are not moral and righteous, then they will be selfish and evil, and they will destroy each other for their own benefit. And so a society, a free society, cannot function. The only way people can function in that way is through the chains of despotism, as he puts it here. Here's a quote from George Washington. "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked, on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." And this is something we have to understand as well, especially as we think about the holiday that we have, the memorial of our independence, that the very concept, the concepts of freedom and not government given, but government protected rights and the natural rights of man and all these things that our forefathers fought and died for, they knew very well that the success of it, that whether liberty would be considered as an actual viable form of government for people, an actual viable way for people to live, would be to a large degree, if not completely, staked on the success of the American experiment. And that success is staked completely on the activity and the sacrifice and the work of the average American citizen. That is something we have to recognize and consider ourselves, whether we're really doing what we need to maintain that. And if it has gone off the tracks, to go back to it. Here's another quote from Thomas Jefferson. "The spirit of 1776 is not dead. It has only been slumbering. The body of the American people is substantially Republican, but their virtuous feelings have been played on by some fact with more fiction. They have been the dupes of artful maneuvers, and made for a moment to be willing instruments, in forging chains for themselves. But times and truth dissipated the delusion and opened their eyes." This is something I'd never heard this quote before. I don't think I had, but this was something that I felt was extremely impactful for today. Even back then, Thomas Jefferson realized some problems that had been going on, presumably, but also that the American people can be awakened, that truth and times, the circumstances around us, the events that maybe force us to think about things we hadn't thought about before or hadn't considered in a long time, that they will and can wake the American people up to do their duty, like we just talked about. And then one final quote as we finish from Thomas Paine, the writer of Common Sense, a very influential philosopher on the Founding Fathers. "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it." That's something, and the kind of the final quote I wanted to leave us with, that as we go into this holiday, it's not just a time for barbecues and spending time with family and fireworks, and those things are fantastic, and we should enjoy those. But it is a reminder, a memorial of our responsibility as free men, and if we are to maintain freedom, we must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it. Our Founding Fathers did, many of them losing everything that they had in order to provide this opportunity for us. And if we want the blessings of freedom, and we want to be able to pass that on to our children, we have to undertake the work of maintaining that freedom. That includes personal work, and that includes, if I might use the term, community work. I hope that you all found this very informative and helpful. I hope that you all have a wonderful 4th of July weekend and a wonderful Independence Day, and farewell.